I'm going to start by saying that one of the major hallmarks of the West, i.e., Western liberal democracy, is the concept of freedom of expression. This is something that we have enshrined in our collective sense of what is sacred over centuries. Um, I think it's fair to say it is a sacred concept. It is very, very, very important. Not just in the West, in other parts of the world that value democracy, but in particular in the West. And there has been a case recently that has really galvanized a lot of concern and a lot of debate over to what extent we actually protect this. And I think the implications of this case are quite disturbing. Um, and it also reminds us that we cannot take the notion that we have freedom of speech for granted. In fact, this is probably something that I can't recall if I included it in my video about weaknesses of the West. But definitely, there are certain basic liberties that are, if we are not really careful, going to be eroded away. And that is something we cannot be complacent about. There is a real risk that we can be complacent because it's not affecting us personally. Um, and we maybe think, oh, well, the person was an idiot. They had it coming or whatever. Um, but this is something that, unchecked, could go down a very dark path. And I don't think the Western countries that have this sense of democracy and freedom of expression enshrined are ever going to end up de facto dictatorships. I don't think people would tolerate that, but I do think there is a risk that we could see civil liberties worn away without being checked, and that is something that we cannot take for granted. So the case I'm referring to, because I'm mentioning this case in particular because I think it's a very good example of the sort of thing we need to be very wary of. There's a man in Scotland, a comedian, who I understand goes by the name Count Duckula. Um, his real name is Mark Meakin, 30 years old, and he is from from Coatbridge in Lanarkshire. Well, he went on trial at Airdrie Sheriff Court where he denied committing a hate crime. Now, what was this in relation to? Had this guy verbally abused ethnic minorities? Had he physically attacked someone because of the colour of their skin or their gender or their sexual orientation? Had he harassed someone for one of those reasons? No, nothing of the sort. What he done was in 2016, for a joke, he got his pug dog by the name of Buddha, it was actually his girlfriend's dog, I should say, to raise its paw to archival footage of Hitler. And he got the dog to do this as there was archival footage of the Sieg Heil and Nazi rallies. Now, he has done interviews about this, he's spoken about it subsequently. And he said that as a comedian, his whole thing was as a prank against his girlfriend, to wind up his girlfriend, as he put it, because she saw her dog as a little angel. So it was clearly a joke to show that the dog was not an angel. Um, it was a prank, and I think anyone with some degree of common sense can see it at face value for what it was. I've seen a few interviews with this guy. I've seen his rationale. I've seen the way he's responded to it, and I have seen nothing to indicate that this man is driven by some sort of white supremacy or neo-Nazi ideology. In fact, he said the opposite is true. So he has had 2 years of legal wrangling, and he has now been found guilty of committing a hate crime at Airdrie Sheriff Court. I don't know what the consequences are. I don't know if that means he has a fine or, if even worse, he could serve jail time. I don't know. Um, Sheriff Derek O'Carroll found him guilty of a charge under the Communications Act that he posted a video on social media and YouTube which was grossly offensive because it was anti Semitic and racist in nature. Interestingly, one of those who have defended him is Daniel Badil, or David Badil, the comedian, who is very vocal about anti Semitism and has defended this guy. Many others have as well. Um, And this is something that has actually united left and right, because even the Guardian, even the Guardian newspaper, which is you would often think is one of the main promoters of political correctness, has criticised it as being an attack on freedom of expression. Ken M. Malik in the Guardian, and that's across the board. It was in the Independent as well. I would suggest the vast majority of people looking at this case are seeing the prosecutors really, really overreacting. Now, was the stunt naive? Was it in bad taste? Perhaps. Um, we are talking about one of the most murderous dictatorships in history. So was it in bad taste? Perhaps. And perhaps the guy was a bit short-sighted in terms of the power of social media. He felt that only his friends and people who understood his humor would see it. Um, I mean, what they seem to be basing this on, what the prosecutors seem to be basing this on, he added, in my view, it is a reasonable conclusion that the video was grossly offensive. Um, the description of the video as humorous is no magic wand, but this is a man who is now facing a criminal record, who is being smeared as a bigot and a hateful person who is stoking up racial tensions because he made a joke. I think that is really, really concerning. They say the right to freedom of expression comes with responsibility. Yeah, it does. But for goodness sake, don't prosecute someone for making a joke. I think the most that should have happened, if anything, the person or people who complained about this guy should have just complained on his video, said, "Oh, they're not funny" or something like that. But to actually go to make criminal proceedings, it's deeply concerning. Um, I mean, maybe the dog should be questioned. Maybe the dog should be questioned as to where it got its racial hatred from. Maybe the dog has issues against French poodles or Japanese Shih Tzus. Maybe too many foreign dogs in our streets. But you have to, it's so absurd, it is almost laughable. These prosecutors, people who push cases like this, who try to destroy someone's life because of something that everyone can see at face value. I mean, this guy has went through almost 2 years of legal hell. I can't imagine the stress. And I just think it's very sinister. I mean, we have to be very clear about this. Incidentally, Tommy Robinson, who co-founded the EDL, he's no longer associated with it. Some have said that Meacher has made a mistake by allowing people like Tommy Robinson to take on this case, to promote it. And I know he's been interviewed by Tommy Robinson. I personally have very mixed views on Tommy Robinson. I would say Meacher needs to be careful not to allow neo-nationalist types to hijack it. That is one thing I will say. He needs to be careful about that. But whatever way you look at it, even if they do, which they inevitably will, jump into it and say we're the real fascists or the prosecutors. The point is this sort of overreach, this sort of abuse of power, which that's what I see it as, is only going to galvanize the far right. I don't believe this guy is far right at all, but I think that this is the sort of thing that is going to galvanize them and say that we're living in dictatorship. They will call it a Marxist, social Marxist dictatorship. They will use that sort of rhetoric to make people feel that the powers that be, the elite, whatever you want to say, all it will do is bring up conspiracy theories and so on. But there is real issues here, and I think it is a scary indictment of just how careful we have to be. I've been very critical of other countries. I've been very critical of the situation in Thailand with their lèse majesté laws. I've been critical of Islamic states with their blasphemy laws. And I stand by all that criticism. But we shouldn't be too smug and too like, oh, we have freedom. Because cases like this show that you need to be very careful. I think it's a complete disgrace they've wasted taxpayers' money by prosecuting this. This man is clearly not a threat to anybody. I could understand someone being prosecuted if they're, for example, verbally harassing ethnic minority people on a transit system, or if someone is clearly coming out with ethno supremacist feelings. Um, then yes, it's logical to prosecute them because violence will follow. But to anyone who's condoning this and saying, oh, well, the guy should be prosecuted because you shouldn't joke about the Nazis, well, where do you draw a line? Where do you draw the line? Who gets to define what is a hate crime? And that's what I find concerning about how hate crimes are being prosecuted. They started off, the legislation to bring in a hate crime statute was well intentioned, i.e., it was to protect people genuinely from harassment and vile racist abuse. That was a good thing and it was needed. But I do feel that this case demonstrates that this can be very easily abused because basically the law states that someone doesn't even have to report the crime for a crime to have been committed. In other words, the police themselves can determine if it was offensive or not. I find that deeply concerning because it opens a way for an abuse of power, and it's a complete and utter disgrace. Um, Anyone looking at this in an open-minded way would see that this guy is clearly not a threat to Jewish people or to other minority people. Was the joke in bad taste? Perhaps. But if we're going to, if we're going to do people for having jokes in bad taste, why the hell is Frankie Boyle not on trial? I mean, for goodness sake, Frankie Boyle has mocked disabled children. Roy Chubby Brown has come out with some pretty disgusting and tasteless humour. Why do they get a free pass? I mean, this guy is just, he's not well known. He's not a public figure. So why is he being prosecuted? I think that's also a legitimate question. The truth of the matter is, as Majid Nawaz says, if you're only defending those opinions you agree with, then you're actually defending yourself. You're not defending the principle of free expression. You have to be prepared to defend those that you don't agree with. Um, so if you find maybe his sense of humour was a bit crude and tasteless, although I'm not really sure who it would be offending, maybe Jewish people, I guess, but if you find it tasteless, okay. So either don't watch his video or leave a negative comment on the video. But don't. How anyone would feel this needs to go to court, I find pretty shocking. And the only way that we make sure we don't go down the abyss with this is to forcefully condemn it, to forcefully condemn this abuse of power and put pressure on the government to maybe make hate crime legislation far more clear. Because as it stands, it's entirely open to interpretation. As far as I'm concerned, hate crime should be specifically if someone has been a victim of abuse, or if there is a real indication that someone's speech is likely to galvanize violence or persecution of minorities. So if someone gets up, let's say an Islamist hate preacher or a white supremacist gets up and says, I hate this group and my followers should, give them a hard time. I have no problem with that sort of person being prosecuted because that sort of speech does lead to violence. But someone making a joke with their girlfriend's dog, to prosecute that as a hate crime is sinister, to be quite honest. And I know many people feel strongly about this. So the answer to this is to put pressure on the government to seriously review how hate crime is dealt with, because at the moment I see it being seriously abused as a concept. Yes, we absolutely need to protect people from being harassed or abused. So I've no sympathy for some racist drunk, mouthing off at ethnic minority people on a train. And you do see that, and it's horrible. I've no problem with them being dragged before the court and facing justice because that is abuse, that is hurting somebody else. But for goodness sake, someone making a joke on the internet with their girlfriend's dog, it's a disgrace that I think also an aspect of this is that he's an easy target because he's not actually a dangerous individual, so he's an easy target. And they're sort of holding him up in the pillory as an example, and it's disgusting, quite honestly. I'll leave it there. Let me know your thoughts.